I'm Chris Beals. I'm the CEO of Weedmaps. Weedmaps is the oldest and largest technology company serving the cannabis space. We essentially provide business-in-a-box functionality of software for retailers between online ordering, digital advertising, menu management, fleet management for delivery, point-of-sale software, a whole host of other things, and then the same thing for brands in terms of enabling brands to build voice and audience with consumers. I've been with the company for over 5 years now, originally coming aboard as general counsel and then taking over the role as CEO a year and a half ago, actually. When I joined Weedmaps, so I first actually was working at an investment fund, and I came across Weedmaps in that capacity probably in late 2014, early 2015. And so, the industry is in a very different space. I mean, in terms of my personal experience with cannabis, I consume cannabis. I actually have a family member, a cousin who served over 20 years in federal prison for cannabis, was released in the early 2000s. It wasn't something that, I really set out and thought, yes, there's a path forward here. And I think as I really got into learning more about Weedmaps, learning more about the space, I think I was really intrigued by, I think, both the opportunity and the sort of path forward that Weedmaps had. But then I think more broadly, I think just, I think it troubled me a lot, I think, the role that cannabis illegality played in, I think, a whole host of social injustices that it played in terms of, I think, frankly, putting a lot of people in jail, while at the same time you saw this industry emerging and a lot of people starting to sort of gravitate towards this green rush. And I think, and so I think in that way, it was really my entry into cannabis, I think, was an intriguing one. And that, the more I looked at it, the more I thought about it, I think the more complicated it was. It was sort of like an onion. And I think that continues to today. I think we're still facing sort of the ongoing growth of the legalized cannabis industry, while you still have a whole host of people left behind in the illegal cannabis industry. You have a whole host of people left behind in who are still in prison right now for cannabis crimes. We continue to have issues with disparate enforcement of cannabis drug laws against people of color. And so, as much as I'd like to tell a compare and contrast and say, when I first joined the industry, it was this way, and now it's different. In a lot of ways, it's still more of the same. Yeah, it's funny. Even though I kind of went, as a lawyer, I ended up becoming a lawyer by training. I was actually originally an engineer, and to make extra money during law school to pay my way through, I actually did like website design and stuff like that. And so, and then when I was on the law side, I did a lot of tech startup advisory work and that sort of thing. And I think what really intrigued me about Weedmaps was the amount of data that they had, and I think just sort of how big the opportunity was to improve patient access, to improve the way that businesses could operate through better software that built compliance and through the ability to manage data. And so the opportunity seemed really immense, but at the same time, I think that opportunity was really paired with taking, something that was really complex. Cannabis is a really complex plant. It has a really complex set of effects on people. The laws and regulations are incredibly complex. Every single state, and often every single city you go to, handles things completely differently. And so, I think Weedmaps sits at sort of that unique intersection where we can use software and data solutions to try and solve a whole bunch of problems. And that's really what I think drew me to the opportunity. Yeah, so I think there's a couple parts to that question. So maybe I'll kind of, unpack it. I mean, in terms of Weedmaps, the tech company and sort of how it's evolved, when Weedmaps first started, it was really around this idea of how do we help consumers find where cannabis retailers are, especially in the Prop 215 era in California. It was incredibly difficult to have patients easily find where a cannabis retailer was, but then more importantly, find a specific product or understand that. And so right away, you ran into that issue that, unlike what, people sometimes incorrectly believe, that sort of cannabis has a uniform effect. There are all these people looking for different products that were going to treat their medical ailment or affect them in a specific way. across a whole bunch of retailers that were incredibly difficult to find when you had the medical cooperative model in California. Since then, where we evolved is really around this thing that it's incredibly difficult to reach cannabis consumers, or for retailers to sort of sell cannabis without fundamentally being able to show what you have at any given time. I mean, cannabis is a agricultural product. It is a non-shelf stable agricultural product. What's in stock at one point is not at the other. And so really a lot of Weedmaps evolution and growth is how can we better service cannabis consumers and businesses by basically giving as rich of information as possible on what's available and what's there. I think that naturally led to us doing things like direct integrations with third-party point-of-sale software systems. So we integrate with most third-party point-of-sale systems to enable live menuing and that sort of thing. That then pushed us more towards, for a lot of as you see sort of the growth of licenses, we offered our own point-of-sale software system to make sure that, there was a solution that would reach all cannabis consumers. As we started to see, moving forward, I think more formal legalization regimes that allow delivery and that sort of thing, we started expanding that to how do we provide compliant online ordering solutions. The regs are incredibly complex. So then that entailed, well, how do you do fleet management to go with that? California requires that you GPS track all your drivers to do delivery. Other states require the same thing. Nevada has, for delivery, limits on how much can be in the trunk that are based on weight. In California, they're based on dollar amount. Oregon, they're based on dollar amount. And so, how can you use software to solve this? And so that's really been the growth and trajectory of Weedmaps. I think has largely been an organic one, but based upon that fundamental premise of how do you help patients find what they want in the easiest way possible? And how do you help retailers who are, grappling with a whole host of regulatory issues and the fact that, cannabis consumers are not a set group of people. How do you help them reach, cannabis consumers, regardless of age, race, gender, so on and so forth. And the same thing for brands. So that's been the evolution of Weedmaps as a technology company and really where we're going. And so it's continued push on, how can we make that easier? And I think the thing that's been fascinating with that is because we've always had that focus on consumers, I think that's where that's really the strength we bring to bear. So when you look across who is the Weedmaps user, over about 75% of cannabis or of Weedmaps users consume daily. About 80% purchase every other week. And so when you look at who's on the platform, it is cannabis consumers. And that's a really hard sort of segment to reach and to pin down because cannabis consumers come from all walks of life. And so of all the people who come to Weedmaps, every single session, about 20% of the time, they're actually purchasing something. And so that's really been an important thing is because we are of and sort of by the cannabis consumer, that's really influenced our audience and who comes to Weedmaps and who's using the site. It's been an interesting thing because as much as operators in each individual state want to think, well, this is where we're at, or this is sort of everything there is, every single state is just so unique and so different. And trying to track what's happening on the ground is complex. We do a lot of regulatory work and legislative policy work aimed at opening up, aimed at doing prisoner release, record expungement, aimed at ensuring there's social equity programs so that if these licenses are being issued, they come out equitably, especially to people who have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs, which is Black and brown people. I think the other part of that also is if you see these legalization regimes roll out, they're very wonky, very sort of uneven. And a lot of times what we're left with is kind of guessing. When you're building, when you're trying to build software that tracks the ecosystem, and when you have a company ethos that's sort of supporting legalization and growing, every once in a while you have to make judgment calls. Well, where's legalization going to go? What's going to happen? And so, I think for us, it's really we're just constant students of sort of where the industry is going and what's happening. Every new state we want to offer a piece of software in, we have to tailor the software to some degree to the rule set for that state. And separately, a lot of times there's directional judgment. Well, are they going to allow delivery in the future? Are they, Massachusetts, for instance, for delivery is saying they're going to require body cameras. We need to support. We're vehemently opposed to that. That goes against a whole host of things, including, I think, a lot of people's rightfully held concern about being prejudiced or persecuted for being a cannabis consumer. So while we're opposed to that camera requirement, on the flip side, with our delivery and logistics solutions, we start building now for when delivery starts this next year to support that future sort of Massachusetts body cam requirement. And so, the nuances kind of go on. I think separately in terms of, the transition states from the illicit market to the licit market, I think that's really difficult too, because, a lot of times the licensing doesn't roll out quickly. And so you're left with a lot of people who are sort of stuck waiting in limbo, trying to get licensing and that sort of thing. So, I think that's another thing is as we think about software and that sort of thing, we spend a lot of time thinking, what role can we play in helping, these social equity businesses or small business owners and that sort of thing. We're already going through a ton of hardship. How can we provide software at an economical price that lets them get up and running and compete with well-funded, publicly traded, multi-state operator competition? And so, I think that's, I think there's a great, or I guess I should say that we potentially through software, can help provide, I think, a more equitable and even sort of playing field for folks to compete on as this cannabis opens up and becomes more accessible. We have to build so much compliance functionality into our software. So we have to support if it's delivery, the driver tracking on POS, reporting to the state track and trace system and that. And I think one thing that's difficult is we're always sort of on the leading wave. A lot of times these states will pass regulations, often really rigorous regulations, and they won't really think through the cost or the impact on the business. We have no choice. We have to build to support that. But often what we find is then customers don't want to use those features because regulators aren't enforcing those rules. And that's not a bad thing. So oftentimes these rules are onerous and restrictive and that sort of thing. But that's something we often have to face. I think, and I think I remember not that long after I came aboard at Weedmaps, Washington State made the transition from its medical system to adult use, the sort of I-502 transition. And I remember at the time, there were all these promises that the medical operators were going to have a path to be part of the adult use market and sort of continue forward. And what ended up happening was that promise was reneged on. And I remember, personally fielding calls from folks kind of in tears saying, I mortgaged my house to get this medical business up and running. What can I do? And all I could, and I think I'll have a path forward. I'll be able to do it. And all we could say is look, we're, it's pretty clear, here's what it is. We'll refund you all the money you've paid us for your package. But we're going to have to delist you. And that was tough. And some of the people made it through and eventually then got adult use licenses. But that was really my first taste of, I think, how cruel that transition or evolution can be when you have an existing legacy market and then you move to this other market and somehow, the regulatory agency or the governmental body or the legislature chooses to ignore that they already had a functioning system there. And that's really imposed a lot of hardship on people. And I think it's doubly difficult when, not to pick on Washington, but for instance, they put really stringent requirements on who could lend money or invest in cannabis businesses. They required you to have state residency, which facially seems like a neutral thing. But what it meant is that people who were not high net worth, people who did not have a body of investors that they could draw on, couldn't get licenses because you couldn't go out and sort of raise funding from other people. It massively limited the funding for which you could avail yourself. And to the extent you could find funding, it was really overpriced because people knew that they sort of had you. In terms of Weedmaps, COVID was definitely a bit of a curveball for us. I think we were fortunate. We switched to work from home, I think, before a lot of tech companies did. And which I think was definitely the right move. And then separately, I think we've been spending a lot of time in terms of workplace and culture and doing things like virtual happy hours or trivias or that sort of thing. And also we're mindful that it gets stressful. People have kids at home, that sort of thing. And so we've been trying to give periodic, Fridays off, that sort of thing, to try and help manage the stress. And I think that's, one thing that's not talked about a lot is, work from home is, and is more stressful, is more difficult. And so we're trying to do what we can to support the internal team on that. In terms of COVID as it relates to the cannabis space, and more specifically what we've been doing, I think we were very nervous. We did on the policy side, we were doing work to help advocate that cannabis businesses be deemed essential business. As it related to the technology side, we're very fortunate that on the logistics and delivery platform, and we have about 11 or 1,200 retailers across the nation that use that we had just gotten through shipping a bunch of new features that really made it easier and more granular for when your order was complete to let the consumer know, to better enable bi-directional discussion, to enable anonymized secure chat between your delivery driver and your business. And this was all stuff we'd done, just prior to COVID, not with the expectation that it would be so critical. But then what we saw is that these features were hugely important. There are a number of retailers in places like Maryland, Oklahoma, California who said, look, the only orders we're taking are online through Weedmaps. It's don't come to the store before your order is ready. If it's for pickup or separately for delivery, we'll do contactless delivery. You will automatically be notified when your driver draws near, and then make sure that you're sort of not waiting around and that sort of thing. And so I think we played a really critical role in terms of enabling businesses to keep their employees safe, but also to manage crowds, as we saw cities kind of have this knee-jerk reaction of, if there's a crowd, we're going to shut it down. It happened with a big dispensary chain in Massachusetts, where they had a line wrapping around the block and the city shut them down. In terms of what we saw transactionally, we've seen over a 400% increase in order volume since COVID started. And the average order size coming through the platform right now is over $100. So, that's a lot of order volume. That's a lot of, I think orders that are being fulfilled safely through the platform. And so I think it's something I take a great deal of pride in, that we were sort of nimble and fast. We were able to pivot and add some other things onto the roadmap, but that we could play a role in helping to keep businesses open and operating safely. And some of that was luck, and some of that was a lot of hard work from our engineering, product, and design team once, we sort of saw where things were going. Yeah, that was a very hectic, very scary time. We fielded a lot of calls from clients asking us to help with sort of, hey, my city's thinking about a shutdown order, that sort of thing. Can you lend a hand? We saw it with a lot of Bay Area cities. We saw it in places like Michigan, Maryland, basically every jurisdiction we operated in, we wrestled with this in some way. And to that end, part of what we did was mobilize in terms of going out and, one, trying to engage with local governments, two, giving materials, things, for folks who reached out to us where we could, basically tell them, hey, here's how you can go, points you can talk about, advocate, that sort of thing. I think in terms of the essential designation, I think one thing that heartens me is that, I think it marks an evolution in terms of how people think about cannabis. The fact that it's taken as something that is relevant, meriting thought. Doesn't need to have a pun in the bio or in the headline when it's written about, that sort of thing. I think as much as I'd like to believe, because I'm a very big believer in the medicinal usage of cannabis and the power of it to treat a whole host of things that, frankly, we prescribe a lot of drugs for. I think the cynic in me thinks that a lot of the conversation was driven by, frankly, cities being concerned, or states being concerned about tax revenue or wanting to protect that piece of it. But that being said, I think even acknowledging a more realistic approach to that tax revenue, or the fact that, if you wanted these businesses to survive, you had to think about them that way, I think was underlying that. I think the other thing that was underlying that was some sense of, I think we in the cannabis industry often try and fight the comparison to alcohol. And that's sort of being lumped in as a vice good, given that cannabis has medicinal value. But I think for better or for worse, I think, being treated in a manner or a level of consideration that had parity to alcohol, which, frankly, has been a long time coming. And the fact that liquor stores and alcohol stores weren't going to shut down, of course, cannabis stores shouldn't be shut down, given the fact that you had people relying on it for pain management and all this other stuff. And so, I was really heartened by seeing that. It was definitely a scary time. There was a lot of kind of white-knuckled moments where cities were, changing their minds, saying, okay, we'll leave things open. But, I'm happy that I think for the most part we ended up in the right place. I think one thing that was interesting for us is average order size moved up about 25% through the orders platform once COVID really hit. I think the thing that's interesting, and then we saw a lot of like mix or shifting in terms of basket composition. And so I think that, and we saw an increased usage or increased purchase levels of edibles, tinctures, topicals, things like that. And I think to some degree, people kind of pointed to that and said, well, because of COVID and the pulmonary issues, people are not buying as many vapes. They're not buying, as much flour, that sort of thing. But I from a little bit of sampling, I think we ascribed it to something different, which is with people having kids at home or family at home and that sort of thing, and dealing with stress, that there was, I think, people trying to be, or being in a crowded apartment building during the day, people are maybe trying to be a little bit more surreptitious with their consumption was part of it. I think we've seen, I think that average order size, topped over 110 to 115 for a bit. And now we're seeing it, it's back down at about 100, which feels to be a sustainable level. And I think, frankly, within that reflects, new consumers starting to purchase more regularly. But then I think consumers kind of normalize at a consumption level that frankly probably is tied a bit to stress management, dealing with sleep and anxiety issues, but then people just realizing that if I'm home, this is probably a better, healthier way to relax than a whole host of other things. I think the other thing we've seen is, we've really seen the acceleration of growth. I think we're estimating that it looks like, parsing through our data, that 2020 cannabis sales will be about $15 billion this year across the U.S. I think within that, there's nuanced things like the Chicago market, or not Chicago, the Illinois market, but Chicago's a big part of that, opened up at the beginning of the year, and we've seen rapidly increasing sales. And one thing that's a little difficult, or that's interesting, is there's a very limited number of licenses. So you're seeing individual stores in some cases do over 1 million or 2 million a week. So obviously that's going to level out, I think, as more licenses are issued. I think the other thing that we've seen is an increased openness and dialogue on our legislative and policy work in terms of governments, both at the local and state level, start to say, let's think about cannabis. How can we regulate it more efficiently? I think there is a growing cognizance of the fact that used to say, well, do you want cannabis or do you not want cannabis in terms of legalization? And I think there's a growing understanding that it's like, do you want to have safe, legalized cannabis, or do you want to try and spend money on continuing the war on drugs and still have cannabis? And I think there's some increased understanding of that. I think, we'll see this year, between on the ballot, New Jersey moved towards adult use legalization, Arizona adult use legalization, Mississippi will probably move. There's sort of, I won't exhaustively list all of them, but there's some exciting movement there. I think. But yeah, I think overall, this year, despite COVID, I think will continue to be a strong year of growth for the cannabis side. Yeah, I think for a lot of small business owners and for all intents and purposes, basically all social equity business operators, as they open up, a lot of them are, they're sole proprietors, they're small operators, and I think there's sort of been a feeling, which you pointed out, that it's, well, here's a license, what more can we give you? The rest is easy from here. I think the reality is look, you have some places, LA is a good example, forcing people to sit on real estate and leases for licenses that were supposed to be, Prop 64 passed 4 years ago at this point, and they still have not, 70% of jurisdictions in California still don't have cannabis licensing for retail. And so in LA, you've had this promise of more licenses being issued. They've allowed the pre-ICO licenses to receive licenses and said, well, we'll issue hundreds and hundreds of more retail licenses, including to those harmed by the war on drugs. And I think what you've seen is those people have been facing delays and delays and delays. In other places, I think, yeah, that's an interesting place where we can play, is if we can say, look, here's POS software, here's menu software, here's online ordering stuff, here's a customer success person to help you get up and running, and we'll provide it all to you for free. We'll give you support. Here's materials that can go along with that. If we can play some role in sort of helping people over that bridge from having that license in hand to it actually meaning something and being operational, that's a role that's where we're playing, and that's where we want to be. I think, to that end, I think, not to cannabis policy is near and dear to my heart, so not to bend back to it again. But I think one thing that would be great to see is if more jurisdictions doing social equity programs realize that capital is needed in this space and start thinking about small business loans, grant programs, assistance programs to help these operators get up and running, because the capital costs are immense, regardless whether it's retail, cultivation, distribution, manufacturing. It's expensive. A lot of stuff. It's big. I mean, obviously, the presidential election will tonally, change course on a lot of things potentially. But in terms of where we're going, I think we're really continuing to push hard on this, delivering this full business in a box functionality to retailers and brands. So we're continuing to drive on more POS integrations. So if you're using third-party POS, you'll be able to have your menu automatically updated when orders come in, or it's a product that's there. But more than that, Missouri will be coming online. I think people have forgotten, that they legalized. So we'll be launching our software offerings there. So there's that work. I think we've started offering, given the COVID reality, the need to have good unbiased reviews of products, to have good information on strains is critical. And so we earlier this year, looking at sort of what existed in terms of research on strains or sort of consumer feedback on strains that have been normalized, actually from someone who's buying the actual product and that sort of thing. We launched a fairly broad strains library, a lot of information drawn from the actual growers and people who own the genetics, and then pairing it with user-generated content, including being able to pair that, because we know who purchases things through the orders platform with verified purchases, that sort of thing. Again, with this idea of if I can't go to a store, I don't have time to browse in person and smell and sort of touch the cannabis. Because cannabis is especially flower and concentrate, is a very tactile sort of sensory thing. And how can we help with better reviews on brands, on brand SKUs, that broadened strain library with actual real information that's not sort of bogus information. So we're going to continue to drive on that through the back half of the year. So expanding out that verified purchaser review system. I'll be honest, we cribbed that from Amazon. It's something that getting good on biased reviews and somebody's actually bought the product is really critical for cannabis. So we'll be continuing to drive in that direction. We've launched some sort of insights and analytics tools to businesses. For a long time, we've had more data than anybody else out there, but we've not surfaced it to businesses as much as we should. And so we've started to offer dashboards and analytics to help them both understand how well they're reaching consumers, but then also sort of what trends are happening in their region in terms of how brands and average price, that sort of thing. Because I think as we see markets kind of tighten, it's important that businesses be able to make efficient decisions when for the most part, the cannabis industry for too long, I think, has been dictated by people just kind of sticking their finger in there and guessing. There haven't been good, strong data tools to really understand what's happening. The other thing is we've had a brands platform since 2017, but we'll be working to expand that, because I think as you see the number of licenses increase, a lot of that is going to be a lot of licenses from manufacturers and cultivators that include brands. And so how do these new brands, these small brands, create voice and audience and affinity with consumers? And so we're expanding our offering and tools with that, so that brands can sort of better build that, and also that brands can more easily reach retail. I think that's one thing that is an interesting transition. In states outside of California, these growers don't have long history of, well, I've been doing this in Emerald Triangle for 4 generations and that sort of thing. And separately, even in places like California, where that longevity and history exists, you have so many new retailers who maybe don't understand the origins and history of the industry, or you just fundamentally have new brands in it. And so brands need a way to show, well, here's my consumer affinity. Here's how fast my products will sell if you carry them. Here's why people love my products. This is what they think. And so continuing to build that piece of it. And then I think the other piece is we're going to continue to drive forward on our social equity and diversity programs, including the business support, and then the work that we've been doing on the policy side on an ongoing basis, in hopes that more jurisdictions will launch social equity programs. Even in California, which I think really was one of the first to move on it. very few local jurisdictions have any social equity programs yet at this point, and that's something that we hope to see change, and that hopefully is supported all the way up to the upper echelons of the state government.